All right, let me start sharing screen as well. There we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second session for our web dev intern training for everyone in ACM. So this week, we're going to talk a little bit about intermediate CSS and how we can collaborate on projects with other people. As a quick recap, we're going to be going a little bit more in depth over how exactly we can make like websites like we covered last week with HTML and CSS. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we can do some extra things to make our websites really pretty, as well as instead of just working on projects by ourselves with GitHub, we're going to see how exactly the workflows work with multiple people all on the same project. So first, let's talk a little bit about some extra CSS. If you guys want to take a look back at the thing that we made last week, which you can see by going to Advaith's GitHub profile by looking here. Let's try to find Advaith's profile, and you can see that with what we have learned so far, it is kind of hard to make things kind of pretty. And let's see an example by looking at his profile. Over here, we have our temp repo that we made last week, and we can view it with GitHub pages. Yeah, as you can see, the site that we have made is not super pretty. And that's because we haven't really talked about some of the cool things you could do in CSS to help lay things out. And first, we're going to talk a little bit about something in CSS called the Css Box Model, which is a little way that we can kind of organize blocks across our code within our website. And if we don't know what the CSS Box Model is, that's completely fine, because we can see an example of it by simply running inspect element. To see an example of the box model, let's go onto the about page of ACM at UCLA and take a look and see what happens. If I hover over something like in this case, let's say I hover over all these cards. And when I hover over this, do you guys see that there are like a lot of colors happening all at the same time? How many colors do you guys think you see when I hover over this? 4. Yeah, we see that we have some green section, red, green, purple, blue, and orange. And if you want to see the box model in action, we can, after using inspect element, we can go onto the right side and click on, where is it? Let's see. Computed. And inside the computed section, you can see that we have multiple things that are showing up inside of the computed box. Specifically, if you see on the right here, it says margin, border, padding, and the final thing is content. So today we're going to break down what exactly these 4 things are and how we can use them to basically describe to our computer how we want things to look using the CSS box model. And to do that, let's go ahead and make ourselves an example. So as you remember last week, we can start by making an index.html page. And this is a basic page, which just has nothing inside it for now. And let's say we wanted to do something cool. As opposed to saying the leadership, let's say that we wanted to make a bunch of boxes that said all of the committees within ACM. Let's go do that right now. So you can remember, we can do this by making a bunch of divs and putting the name of each committee, like I'll put studio, and then the studio is SPC, and I'll just do 4 for now. Design, and finally, cyber. I'll just put 4. And now I'm going to go ahead and style some of these things by adding and giving them all a class. Do you remember how we can like tell our index.css page that we want to choose a specific element or a type of element that we want to style with? Yes, we were going to do that, but first we should like like describe how can we choose and tell our like code that we want to grab this specific element to style. And the way we can do that is with a CSS class. So let's go ahead and add a committee for each of these divs. And like what Sid said, we can also link our style sheet like so. Style sheet. And then href index.css. And now let's go ahead and give our plain Jane document, which we can see by double clicking within our browser, like here. Let's go show it up over here. Our plain Jane document with just Studio, ICPC, Design, and Cyber. Let's go ahead and spice it up by making all our committees, which you can grab with this. We can make their background color, let's make it tomato for contrast. And let's also give it a width of 200 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. And let's see how it looks now. All right, so as you can see, right now we have a bunch of little squares that all have the title and name of our thing, of like each committee. And it's a bit hard to read, so let's make the font size a bit higher. Font size 40 pixels. All right, now that we can see this here, let's see what do we want to do within here. And let's take a look at the different properties of the box model. So right now we have all of these different squares set up, but we want to make them a little bit farther apart from each other. Which property do you guys think that we can use to make all the squares farther apart? And to reiterate, like we saw last time, the different properties within the box model are like so. Over here, we have margin, border, padding, and content. What do you guys think we can use in order to make everything spaced apart? Sure, let's try adding a bit of margin around everything. Let's give it margin of 20 pixels. And let's see what happens. When we added the margin of 20 pixels, everything has become farther spaced apart. And if you look inside of our box model, with the Inspect Element tab, we can see that we've added the margin, which is specified here by 20 pixels around our box. And there's something else I want to note. You see how for a margin, we have not specified a color for the margin. And if I add in, like, let's say, if I change the background color of our entire page and make it, let's say, thistle, do you guys think that the margin is still going to stay white, or do you think the margin is going to turn into thistle along with it? Let's see. And we can see that Sid is right. What happens is that whenever we make the margin, like whenever we made the margin property, even though we did not have to specify the color along with it, what we can see is that the color of the margin takes up the space of the parent element around the element that is associated with it. In this case, we can see that the parent element is the body, which has a background color of thistle, and each individual div is a child of the body. And when we specified margin, we can see that the color of the margin is in fact not the color of our div that we've styled, but the div of the parent, which is the body in this case. Now that we've made a bit of a margin, let's try adding something else. Let's try adding some padding this time. And let's see how that looks. Padding of 20 pixels. After we add padding, do you guys see anything different within how it looks now? let's make it a bit bigger so we can get a bit of like more contrast between everything. What do you guys think padding does? Yeah, looks like the text is a bit further than the edges. And if we see what happens when we put padding, we can see that this green section here, what it did is that it added 50 pixels around the text of our thing, and it has spread it out across before the edge of the border. And in this case, we can see that when we added padding, we also did not specify the color of the padding. However, do you guys see the clear difference between the color between our margin, which is shown in orange, and our padding, which is shown in green? Yeah, as we can see, the margin takes up the color of the parent element, while our padding takes up the color of our element itself. All right, cool. Now, finally, let's talk a little bit about content. And let's see if we try doing content, the way that we can specify the width and height of a content is actually nothing that we have to do. When we specified content, we actually made it the width and the height. And remember that when we looked inside of inspect element with computed, we saw that the content section did not have a title for it. And that's because in the other sections of CSS, where we have to specify it by specifying a margin or a padding, with content, we don't have to specify anything, and we can specify the width and the height directly. And another thing to note is that when we said margin 20 pixels, this is actually a shorthand way of specifying the margin across all 4 sides of our object. Like for instance, we can, if we wanted to specify the left margin of something and only make things have a margin on the left side, we could do that as well to make it a little bit more margin on the left. Or if we want to make a little more margin on the top, we can make the margin on the top a little bit more as well. So margin and padding is the short way for us to describe all 4 sides of our element. Do you have any question on margin and padding so far? And a key difference between margin and padding is that margin and padding both add space, but what we can see is that margin adds space between elements, while padding adds space within the element itself. And now let's try adding a bit of border, and let's see what we think border does. And border takes in a bunch of different things. Let's say we can add in a border that is black, 2 pixels wide, and dotted. And let's see what happens. What we can see is that with the border, similarly to how we said that we can use margin to specify multiple things at once, we can use border to specify multiple things at once as well. Within the border, we can say what color we want our border to be. We can tell it how big it wants to be with pixels, and the type of the border we have, like from dotted or a solid line. Like so. And we can see that we have made a border around our object. Okay, now that we made a little bit about our border, let's go back and see some differences between like margin and some interesting things that we can see when we try doing special things. So we see how we have made like each individual class have a committee here. What happens if we try inserting a really special box and give it a committee class, and we want to add something else to it? Let's give it an ID this time and call it ID special. And so let's find where our special box is. Special box is right here. And right now, for everything that we have, we know that the margin in between everything we're setting back to be 20 pixels. Now, what happens if instead of setting the margin for everything, I want to set the margin bottom to be 40 pixels? Okay, margin bottom 40 pixels means that now what we expect to happen is that the margin between everything is 40 pixels wide. Okay, now that's all good and dandy. What if we wanted to specifically target our special ID and we want to give it a margin top of 80 pixels, of also 40 pixels? So what we have right now is that we have Studio here, which has a margin of 40 pixels all around. I mean, margin of the bottom of 40 pixels. And we have Special Box have a margin top of 40 pixels as well. When I press save, do you guys think that the margin in between is going to be 40 pixels wide or 80 pixels wide? Who thinks it's going to be 40 pixels wide? The ID. So we have a index.html here. Our special box, we've applied another special property to our div, which is over here. You think it'll be 40 pixels? Yeah. Let's see. Huh, that's interesting. It looks like even though we specified margin top to be 40 pixels on top of having a margin bottom 40 pixels, it looks like they didn't add up because the Studio has a margin on the bottom to be 40 and our special ID also has a margin top to be 40 as well. The reason why it did not add any extra margin is due to something called margin clamping. And what margin clamping is that when you specified the margin between two different objects, it doesn't add them up to be exactly like margin top of this one plus margin bottom of this one. The way that it does it is that it gets the greatest size between the two and makes that be the margin in between. And for clarification, what I mean is that if I make this 60 pixels instead of becoming 40 plus 60 pixels, so the size in between is the greater between 40 and 60, in this case, 60. Do you have any questions on how margin clamping works? Nice. And like you said before, now when we take a look at something, we can kind of see where all of the margin, border, padding, content can come into play. So real quick, we can take a look at these little boxes we have here. And what do you guys think that we use in order to specify how big the box of each person is? Between margin, border, padding, and content. Content. And let's see. We can see that if we go here, we specify how big it is with the blue section, which is content. And by default, that is the behavior that we can see inside of CSS. So if we go back to our main sheet over here, and right now, we have specified the width and the height to be 200 pixels. If I make the border to be 50 pixels, or let's make it 10 pixels, do you guys think that the size of our box is going to increase, or do you think it's going to stay the same? Right now, we can see that the size of our box is 200 by 200. Let's see. Looks like our box has become a bit bigger. And that's because when we set width and height to be 200 pixels, we are implicitly setting another CSS property. And that CSS property is called box sizing. By default, the box sizing is content box, which means that when we set the width and the height of an element, what it sets is the width and height of the content section. However, if we wanted to change the behavior and make it so that we wanted each box to be sized, like if each box that we have also has a border, we can change it so that if we want this entire thing to be 200 pixels instead, we can simply change our box sizing to saying content box to saying border box. And what border box does is that it makes it so that our entire square here is 200 boxes, counting from the border as opposed to counting from the content. Do you have any questions on how box sizing can help us specify width and height along with border versus content. Nice. In that case, we're going to go on to moving on from the, okay, let me change this back into content box. Now that we've talked a little bit about how we can use the box model in CSS, let's talk a little bit about some more properties that can be a bit confusing. If you guys see here, when I hover over this, isn't it weird how it says the margin goes all the way across the page as opposed to just being the box itself? The reason why that's the case is through something called the display property. And what the display property is that it tells us if we want things to be, how wide we want things to be on the display. So for instance, if I change this to display inline, let's see what happens now. We can see that each of our boxes, instead of taking up the entirety of the page, it only takes up the perfect amount of space that it needs to. And that's because display inline makes it so that whenever you make something, it only makes it as wide as it needs to be. And some HTML tags that have display inline by default are spans, but something that has display block by default, on the other hand, let's see what display block does. We can see that display block makes it so that the size of whatever thing that we created that is display block takes up the entirety of the width of the parent element around it. We can see that display block makes it so that it's as wide as the entirety of the thing around it. And we can specify this as well by, if we make another div, like let's call div class equals container around everything. And let's make our container say, let's make it 80% of the width of our page. What we can see is that inside of our div class equals committee, it doesn't go all the way across the entirety of the page now. It only goes across 80%. Or we can see that more clearly if we make this 60%. Refresh, and we can see that inside of our div class equals committee, it only becomes as big as the width of the container around it. Do you have any questions on how display works versus block and inline? Nice. In that case, now we're going to talk a little bit about the position property in CSS. And we can see the position property with this special box here. Let's say with a special box, I wanted to move it into the center of the page. The way we can do that is by going into our div ID equals special and giving it a special property with position. Now, by default, what position is that the position of every element by default is static. And what position static means is that they simply just put all of our elements on a page one after another. And if we specify a position to be something else, like absolute, like it says here, it says that position absolute changes it so that it looks at the size of our window and we can change it to be wherever it wants. Like let's say we want it to be 500 pixels from the left, and we also wanted to make it 500 pixels away from the top. We can specify like so. And if you look at our special box, you can see that now it is 500 pixels away from the top and 500 pixels away from the left. There are a lot more different positions you can use in CSS. So if you want to take a look at them, you can take a look at the CSS position property over here. And we can see the whole list of them by simply searching up W3 schools position. And I think this is a really cool interactive way to see all the different types of CSS positions are, because it gives you a try it yourself to see what the differences are between all of them. Like for instance, if we wanted to change our position to be, let's see, CSS position W3 schools with the layout. Like for instance, we talked a little bit about position static, and now we can use something else called position relative. And let's see what position relative is. If we make our box back to be position relative, and we refresh the page, it's back to normal. What position relative does is that when we specify things like left or right, and we give it like 50 pixels, what this means is that we are going to make it 50 pixels from the left of where it's supposed to be relatively. And for a clear example of this, we can look inside of W3 schools. So normally by default, the div over here is right there. However, if we want to make the position different, like let's say we wanted to make it 100 pixels away from the top, from normal, we can put top 100 pixels, which makes it so that it is 100 pixels away from where the top normally is. There's a lot of different things we can do in CSS positions as well, like position fixed. What position fixed means is that, like we can see an example of position fixed with the nav bar within ACM at UCLA. If you see, when I scroll the page, this section at the top here always stays at the same height. The way we can do that is with the position fixed property, which means that whenever you scroll past something, it's still going to stay there. Let's see what else we have. We talked about position absolute, which means that it'll make it relative to the size of the window, or position absolute can also be used relative to another position property, like here. If we use position absolute within here, we can specify how far we want the top to be from the top left corner. And finally, we have position sticky. Something you can do in position sticky is that normally it's there like position static. However, when you scroll past it, you can see that it stays on the top of your screen. It doesn't go away. So this is a quick overview of all the different layout positions we could have. Do we have any questions on how these work? Yeah, like, outside of the div, let's see. So what you're proposing is that, like, if we have our container, let's make this position relative. And let's make the height 80%. And let's specify what our container looks like by giving it a background color of blue violet. And what is your question?
So I'm not sure like how many pixels we actually need to like have it be outside of that, but if you make like that be like some really large number, would it move outside of it, or would it just like stick to the edge of it?
Oh, that's a pretty good question. Let's actually see. So let's specify the width to be 400 pixels for our container. And now let's try going into our special with position absolute. And let's say that we want to make it 200 pixels away from where it normally should be on the left side, right? And let's see if it can go outside of its parent container. What we can see is that it in fact still does that. And this actually causes a lot of issues sometimes within web development, because sometimes if you don't see where the thing you made on the page is, you might have just accidentally moved it somewhere else outside of the scope of the page itself, and you cannot see it. So thank you for that question. And that shows up a good point of how when you use position absolute, you can still go outside of the box it's supposed to be in. All right. Now that we have made our different boxes here, let's try seeing that right now, every single box that we have is displayed vertically, top to bottom, all on a row, all in a column. What do you guys think we could use using what we've learned so far in order to move them to be from top to bottom to be left to right? Yeah, if we use inline position, if we made everything display inline, let's see. Display inline for every single. What we can see is that they are now, they're all moved to be in line, but it's a bit weird because position is relative. Let us change that. Display. That is probably true. Yeah, the container. Let's try changing the width here. Thank you. Yeah. So what we can see here is that by saying display inline, we can make everything into a row, but they look kind of weird. Another way that we can specify everything to be in a row is, or the old way that we could do that is through something called the table property. And let's see how hard it is to make a table inside of plain HTML. If you wanted to make this into a table that could go all the way across, you could do it like so. For all of our divs here, we have to specify a table, and within a table, you have to make a table body. And all of this content is inside the table body. Once we made a table body, we have to specify, we have to make a table row. And this is all inside of a table row. And inside of a table row, we have to specify table items with TD, table data cells. And we have to make every single thing that we want inside of our table to be specified with a TD. And let's see how we can do that right here. TD. And go here. And the way I'm doing this is by option and clicking. If you want to see how I'm doing this multiple times. And let's see what we've just done by specifying table, table body, TR, and TD. What it did is that it has made everything inside of a table. However, this table is not really responsive. Like if we inspect element and we drag this way, you can see that everything is still not showing up. If the size is too small, you can see that everything's not really aligned properly, and it kind of sucks. And that's because that was one of the really old ways in order to make things inside of a row inside CSS and HTML back in the old days. So let's remove all this table nonsense that we've just made so far, and let's see how we can make something else different and use modern CSS and HTML to do the exact same thing. And we have this div class equals container here. And let's see how we can do the exact same thing with a single line of code. Single line of code we will change is display flex. And let's see what happens. When we say display flex, we have done the exact same thing, which is make everything inside of a column. Inside of a row. And we can see that if we go here, it's still not becoming responsive, but the way we can change that is through the flex properties. And first, let's talk a little bit about what we just did right here. What we just made is that we have made a Flexbox. And what a Flexbox is that it's a way for us to basically describe how things we want to be. And it's a way for us to basically like center whatever we want within a page. Like for instance, if we want to go back to normal, how we had last time, we can change the direction of our Flexbox by setting the flex direction. So if we set flex direction to column, we can see that now everything is going to be aligned across a column. And let's see how exactly this works. If you want to see an example of what a Flexbox is, we have a nice little demonstration inside of our right up. Let me go pull it up over here. All right. What we see here is an example of what a flex container is. And what a flex container has is that it has a main axis and a cross axis. When we have specified our flex direction, that means that we've specified whether we want our main axis to be up and down or left to right. By setting flex direction to be column, we have set our flex direction and main axis to be up and down. Now, let's see something really cool we can do inside Flexbox. If we have our body here, what happens if we make our body become flex? Display flex. And what if we want to center everything inside of our body? Normally, what we can do if we wanted to make it centered normally before, if we have our container here, without Flexbox, we could try setting the margin left to auto change and the margin right to be auto as well to center our content. And like what we can see is that it has successfully moved all of our content to be into the center. However, if you want to use Flexbox instead, without even touching the container itself, we can make it centered by using something cool called, let's set the flex direction to be column and use align content center. And let's see what that does. Oh, I think I messed up. Align items. Yes. And this is align items center. So first, let's talk a little bit about what content is and what items is inside Flexbox. So do you see how, okay, to take a quick step back, we see that when we have made a Flexbox, do we add display flex to our class container, or do we add display flex to each individual committee inside of our code? Oh yeah. So let me remove the body real quick. So let's change back to normal so we can just see the difference between the container and the committees. Like, let's go back to flex direction row. Do we set our Flexbox to be this purple section, or do we set the Flexbox to be this purple section, the container, or do we set it inside of each individual committee? Yeah, we set our flex container to be the container object. And we can specify and manipulate our things a bunch of different ways. Like for instance, in our container, change it back to direction column. And let's make the width, let's specify the width of each committee again to be 300 pixels, 200. And we can now see that we have our purple section, which is our flex container, and all of our little things inside the flex container specified by our orange sections. Now, within a Flexbox, there are two main things that we have to consider. Those are the flex container, which is the thing that is displayed flex, and the flex items, which are all the different things inside. So let's take a look and see what we can do with our flex container. Now, let's say that we want to move all of our flex items to the center of our flex container. The way we can do that is with align content. And let's see what align content does within our container. Oh, did I do the wrong one? Is it align items? Yes, I think I mixed them up. Align items. Now, the word align items seems to be a bit self-explanatory. Do any of you guys want to take a stab at what exactly align items did with respect to our flex container and our flex items? Yeah, As Mia said, it aligned all of the items across our container. And let's see what exactly align items did with respect to our Flexbox. When we said that a Flexbox contains a main axis and a cross axis, we can specify which one we want to choose by using the words justify and align. Justify changes things across the main axis, while align changes things across the cross axis. So when we said align content to be center with the flex direction of being a column, that means that using the cross axis of left to right, we wanted to put it into the center of our container. All right, now that we've done that, let's change our height to be 40 pixels. And we have our container. Let's make our container have a height of 60%. And let's get rid of some of this margin between. Remove more margin between everything. And we have it. All our boxes like so. If we change our height to be, let's make it 100% again. Let's change it to be 800 pixels for our container. Is that exactly 800 pixels? Let's make it 2000. All right, so now we have our Flexbox, which is really big, and we have all our different flex items. And remember how before we used margin to make space in between everything? Let's see how we can add space in between everything using a Flexbox instead. And the way we can specify how we want things to look with respect to the space of our items and space of our container or our Flexbox is through the align or justify content property. And let's see what just align content does, or justify content. Let's try justify content center and see what happens. As a reminder, we have set no margin in between all of our different boxes that we can see on the screen now. Oh, justify content.
This is an essential.
Yeah, what we can see is that we have our content here and our box here, and it has placed it into the center of our box. Now, what if we are doing something else in order to add space in between? And we can use something called space, or justify content space between, and let's see what the difference is between center and space between. What we can see is that what space between does is that it has placed the first item at the very top, the last item at the very bottom, and it added space between all of our separate content. So this is a way to use Flexbox to basically like add space or describe how to place things without using margin. To see a full list of what exactly you can use with justify or align content, you can take a look at this nice little this nice little thing here. And what this shows is that if we had a flex container specified by gray with a main axis or flex direction of being a row, we can see all the different things that justify content would do. Justify content flex start would take all of our items and place them to the start of our container. Flex end, put them all at the end. Center puts them all at the center. Space between takes the first one, puts at the end. Last one puts at the end. Adds space in between. And space around tries adding even space between everything. Do we have any questions on how we can use justify and align content to say how we want to distribute the free space around and within our container?
I'm not sure what the difference between
content and items. Yeah, we're going to go look into the difference between content and items right now. And let's see how we can use the difference between justify content and justify items by looking at a nice little graphic here. So if you want to see justify items, what we can do is that we can make the size of everything just a little bit off center. And let us do that right now. Within our index.html, let's make special, and let's make an ID of special2 for ICPC. Special 2. And let's make special just a bit bigger. Let's make the height be 60 pixels. And let's make special2 have a height of 80 pixels. And let's take a look at our thing now. And let's change our axis to be back into a row so we can see how everything looks. Going index.css and changing our flex direction to be row, and let's do space evenly. All right, so right now what we can see is that we have all of our different things set up into a line. And let's see what the difference is between justified content or align content along with another thing we can change within our Flexbox, which is items. So let's see what happens if now we change it so that we do justify items to be center. And let's see if we change it to be justify items baseline. I think it's align items actually. All right, there you go. So remember that in our case, oh, I forgot because the flex direction that we specified is row. And let's see what align items baseline has done. What align items done is saying that for each individual flex item within our Flexbox, like each little orange section, we say that with respect to the cross axis of the container, which is in this case up and down, baseline says that we want it to start at the base or the start of the cross axis, which is the top. And the key distinction that we want to see between items and content within the Flexbox is that content is how you distribute free space across your container, while items specifies how you want your item to be placed with respect to your Flex container, if that makes sense. Yeah, and if you want to see another example of that, we can take a look at this nice little chart. So remember before, we said that for justified content, we can use this chart to see how we distribute the free space or the gray section within our Flexbox, but we can use with flex items. What this specifies is that instead of specifying the gray area, you specify the different items itself, saying where you want to start with flex start, flex end, if you want the center to be along the center, or baseline to all start along the baseline. Very cool. All right. In that case, let's see one more thing we can do with Flexboxes. And we talked a little bit about the basic things we can do. And now let's try doing a little exercise with Flexboxes with the last 10 minutes that we have. If you want to see inside of our ACM page here, something that you'll learn is that each of these little containers or people is actually a Flexbox. And let's see how we can try to emulate that with what we've learned so far with a Flexbox. So let's go into our div class. And let's try doing a little example. Let's say that we want to add a picture of, let's say we wanted to add a picture of ACM as a whole. Open image in new tab. And let's try doing a little example with Flexbox. First, let's try to break down to see what exactly we want to do. So looks like we want to have a picture and we want to have a description for it as well. So let's see with basically what you want to do div class equals container. Right now, we just have our container with nothing inside of it. And let's see how it looks. Okay. And let's make our container a little bit smaller this time. Let's change the height to be 100 pixels. Let's make the width be 400 pixels. All right, now we have our container here. And how do you think we can use Flexbox to add, let's have our image up there on the top. And then we also want to have, let's have a name of the committee. And let's also have a description of the committee. How do you guys think that we can use Flexbox in order to make it so that we can have, give me one sec, the image on, we want to have the image on one side, and we want to have the description on the other side. What do you guys think we can do within Flexbox?
So you want the description on the left.
So we want like an image on the left side, and then we want description underneath the name. So I think the first thing that we can do is that we can see that there are basically two main parts to our box. We have the image that we want on the left side, and we have the two other sections we want on the right side. And within our container, we can specify that by wrapping our name and description inside of another div. By wrapping it inside of another div, and let's make it class the description, or let's call it subheader. And let's make our subheader a different color to see the difference. Dot subheader. Make the background color of this one tomato. What we can see is that by making justify, okay, let's change our container to be back to the normal. I'll just display flex. And let's make the flex direction be row. What we can see is that we have properly moved our image and our name and description to be on two different rows of what we want to see. Now, how do you think that we can move our image, our name, and description to be within the center of our box or a little container? Justify, let's see. If we use justify and would go across the left to right, but we want to change it with top to bottom. Align, yeah, so doing align items. And the reason, and do you think it's align items or align content? Items, and we can see what the difference is between them. We try doing align items, center. It's properly moved into the center. And the reason why this is the case is because align items specifies how within our item itself, how can we make it? How can we specify where we place the item with respect to the box? If we did not use align items and try doing something else, like align content, what do you guys think will happen if we make align content be center? Looks like nothing has happened. And as you remember, the reason why nothing has happened is because align content uses the free space with respect to the main Flex container, along with the different things inside of it, or the Flex items. If we use align content, we would distribute the free space around the item. However, what we can see here is that there is no free space, which is why doing align content did nothing. All right, let's see if there's anything else that we can do inside of our little box here. So essentially, what we've shown is that we can make some really cool things like having an image, a name and description, and how we can use the Flexbox property in order to make some complex things and break it down into easy step-by-step things. There are a couple more things that I want to discuss about Flexbox before I move on. First, the first thing we should want to see is what happens if we have too many items within our single Flex container. So based off what we have so far, we know that we have our singular Flexbox container. What if we make a bunch of them? Let's go back into our code and add a lot more of these containers. Let's see, we get our div class equals container, and let's say 9 of them. Let's make 9 total, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And let's see how they all look. Now they're all in a row. I mean, they're all inside of a column. To make them look like a row, let's put all of them inside of another Flexbox and make all of these individual containers Flex items. The way we can do that is by wrapping them inside of another div. Let's call this one bigger container. Why not? And let's wrap all our containers inside of it. There we go. And let's denote which is the bigger container by going into index.css. And let's make it a Flexbox. Perfect. All right. Now we have all of our 9 different containers inside of our Flexbox. To denote that this is a Flexbox, let's give it a different background color. Let's make it Azure. And let's see. All right. Now what we can see is that we have made all of our small little Flexbox items, all of our Flexbox containers, and by putting all 9 of them, they are now Flex items inside of our larger, bigger container Flexbox. And you see that if we have a lot of them in a row, it's kind of hard to see all of them all on our small little screen. Even if we make our screen a bit smaller, we see that we have to see all of them, you have to scroll left and right with our bar. Well, there's actually another Flex property you can add in called Flex Wrap, and we can see how that solves that problem. If we add Flex Wrap, let's see what happens. When we add Flex Wrap, you can see that depending on the size of our window, we make it so that the user does not have to scroll left or right to see all of their Flex containers, all their Flex items. See, if our screen only supports showing 2 at a time, it'll only show 2. If our screen can show up to 3 at a time, it will. And we can make this even bigger to show many, many, many different little Flex items on our screen. And we can actually do a little bit more. Like let's say that we can make Flex Wrap, row wrap reverse. And let's see if we make our first one. Let's make our first one a bit special. Let's call it ID. Let's give it another ID of special and put that inside of our, let's make it 150 pixels. And let's give it background color green. Why not? You can see that with Flex Wrap Row Reverse, even though that we've specified our first one to be special, when we do wrap, it actually puts it at the very bottom. If we compare it to how it looks like normally with Flex Wrap regular wrap, you can see that it is at the top. And this is actually very powerful. By simply adding Flex Wrap wrap, we're able to make our display and design of our website work for people on multiple different browsers. It doesn't even matter what size they are. Let's say we're on a phone, for instance, and you have a really small screen. Even if we have a small phone, you can still see everything because the rest of the Flex items in a container wrap around. All right, now that we've talked a little bit about how we can make little different Flex items inside of a container wrap around, let's see what else we can do with Flex items. Let's make a couple more of our containers special. Let's make this one special too. And let's give it one more, let's say. Now we have 3 different ones that are special. And instead of our special containers, you can see that with our containers and within our flex items, what we say is that inside of our bigger container Flexbox, we can give it a justify content or justify items property, like we talked about last time. Justify item center, we can see that what justify or align item center, because since we made our main axis horizontal, everything will be a row. Align item center makes it so that everything is now in the center of the little Flexbox. Like if we inspect element here and look at ID equals special, let's see it. Let's hover over ID. You can see that ID is centered with respect to its contents next to the other items. However, you can actually change this behavior by using the special align self or justify self features. Normally, you say align items inside of a Flexbox to tell your Flex children how you want to be positioned. However, if you want to override what your Flexbox parent says, you could simply use the align self property or justify self property to change that. In our case, we can make align self baseline, and we can see that all our green sections are going to be not centered, while all of our purple ones still stay the same. So with this, we can now see that by simply adding in align self or justify self, we are able to change the layout of specific items inside of our Flexbox to see if we want something to stand out. All right, now that we talked a little bit of Flexbox, let's say that, for instance, what we wanted to do was that even if our screen was big enough, how can we make it so that we only want to show 2 of our items at a time within our Flexbox? And we can see that inside UCLA ACM's page, you can see that you can definitely fit more than 3 of these little sections inside of the leadership section. And if we inspect element, we see that it goes way down. And how can we do that? Let's see how we can make it so that even if we have enough space, we still specify that we only want 2 columns inside of our box at any given time. And the way we do that is actually not through a Flexbox. It's through another Flex container that we can make. And let's see how we can do that. Inside of our bigger container, instead of simply saying that we want a display flex to make a Flexbox, let's try making display to be grid. Now, let's see what display grid does. And we can remove flex wrap because we're making a grid. And when we make grid, so far, it looks like nothing has happened. That's because in order to use a grid, what we have to do is that we have to specify how we want the rows and the columns of our grid to be. In our case, let's say that we wanted to make two columns in our grid be the same size. The way we can do that is through the grid template columns property. Let's say that we wanted our grid to have 2 different columns of the same size. The way we can do that is by putting auto, and let's see what happens. By putting auto, we have made a grid out of our Flex container. We see that even though we have extra space, we are still going to only put 2 items within our grid. If you want to add more, you can also add another auto. If you want to make this be a 3x3 grid instead, like that. Really cool. And instead of saying auto, you can see that what auto does is that it tries making the space be evenly distributed between each thing. If you want to specify the space of a column in your grid specifically, you can instead add in exactly the pixels you want or the size you want. In this case, we can add pixels 200 to make it really small, which will be a bit ugly, as you can see here. Or if you want to be, if you don't want to write out auto 3 times, you can actually say repeat. And we can see, what does repeat do? Repeat auto. And then how do you repeat multiple times? Let's see here. The way we can do that, let's take a look inside of repeat CSS, we can repeat 4 times the value that we want. So if we wanted to make 4 columns, you can say repeat 4 auto. And let's take a look. You can see that repeat 4 auto is the same thing as saying auto, 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 auto 4 times. More than simply specifying the columns of your grid, you can also specify the rows of your grid. The way you can do that is by saying grid template rows instead of grid template columns. Grid template rows. And let's say we only want to have 2 rows inside of our grid. By doing this, grid template rows auto, auto, grid template columns, auto. What you can do is that you can specify how many rows you want in your grid and how many columns you want in your grid by these 2 properties. And grid template columns and grid template rows is actually a really nice thing that you can use in order to specify the layout of grids. In fact, this leadership section here actually is a grid. This is a grid flex container. And let's see. I think the reason why grid template rows in this case did not work was because it tried to figure out how many rows you wanted, but since we had too many things inside of our flex container, it was had a hard time trying to figure it out. And if you want to see more things you can do with a CSS grid or CSS Flexbox, you can just simply search up W3 Schools Flexbox grid to see the differences between CSS grid and CSS Flexbox. Wow, we really covered a lot about flex containers so far with both Flexbox and grid. If you want to practice some more Flexbox properties, there's actually a really cool website you can make, or you can go onto, called Flexbox Froggy. Flexbox Froggy. And what Flexbox Froggy is that it's a really cool way that you can learn how to make Flexbox and see what Flexboxes can do. Like in our case, if you wanted to make this frog go to the end, what if we just said justify content flex end to move it to the end? And this is a really cool way to get a grip on what all the different flex items, flex containers, and different flex properties you can use all can do. The biggest thing I think with Flexbox and grid is that, like all things, it comes with practice. If you really want to see ways that you can use Flexboxes and grids, then just try looking at something online. Like in our case, when we tried making the image name and description thing and how to make that into a Flexbox grid layout, and just experiment. The best way to learn is through experimenting. Overall, I think that Flexbox and grid are some of the most powerful CSS properties. And I think that with time, we can see that how amazing they are and how they can really add spice and make developing websites a lot easier. Now we're going to move on to Advaith to talk a little bit about how to use GitHub and advanced GitHub when working with other people.
Okay, so wait, is your speaker on? Yeah, okay. So we can move on to talking about Git and GitHub. How's that 110% and so tiny? Okay, anyway, let me share screen. Let's get started. So last week, basically, we learned how Git and GitHub is a version control system. So you can back your data up, you can keep track of your history, and you can put your website online. And that's what you learned last week. This week, we're going to cover how to use it for collaboration. And some useful features that GitHub has are organizations, teams, and projects. Organizations are a group of people working on multiple repositories. For example, we have the ACM organization, which is all of ACM. And sometimes organizations can get really, really large. For example, like ACM. And not everyone on the organization works on every single repository. So what you can do is you can group members into teams that work on specific repositories in the organization. So these are ACM teams. And one example of those is the dev team. And you can see that the dev team has the repositories that we maintain. Another feature are projects, where you can keep track of stuff that you need to work on and you can view them in different ways. So basically it's like a Trello board, but for GitHub. So those are the three things. Those are three really cool features that GitHub has. What's going to be more relevant to directly working on GitHub are the stuff that we're going to cover after this, starting with issues. Issues are used to organize work within a project. So you can see exactly what work needs to be done and what you can do to contribute. For example, if you look at UCLA ACM website, you can scroll down and see a bunch of issues that should be done. You can also see that people are assigned to issues. So people are currently working on those issues and trying to fix them. When you click on a specific issue, you see a more detailed explanation of exactly what has to be done. And you can see a discussion about it between people who commented on that. If you have any questions about an issue, you can contact someone who's maintaining the repository or the some person who wrote the issue, and they can assign the issue to you, and they can also answer any questions you have. And when an issue is assigned to you, you're responsible for fixing it. The next thing we're going to talk about are branches. Branches are basically a bunch of different versions of code within a single repository. They're a way for you to work on a new feature in isolation of all the other work that people are doing. Basically, when you work on branches, you're not affected by other people working on the repository at the same time. And all your code is isolated. So you can ensure that whatever you're building works before you actually ship it. Most important branch is the main branch of the repository. Main branch is the one that's deployed whenever someone visits, or it's the initial one when someone clones a repository. So if you look at the ACM website, all the code that you see that made this website is what's on the main branch of this website. All the other branches are other features that are being worked on or something else that's happening parallel to the development of the website, but none of those will affect what's in main. So whenever you want to isolate your work, you work on a new branch and you check it out. If you're a collaborator, you can do this right away and you can directly make a new branch. If you're not a collaborator, you'll have to do something called forking the repository, which is making a copy of the repository for yourself, working on it, and then merging it into the main repository. This is roughly how branches work. Master or main is the main one. And when you want to start working on something, you split it off into a branch, and your work happens in parallel on that branch. Someone else's work is also happening. And then once you're done with your work, you can merge it back into the main one. To see all the branches you can exist, one way to see all the branches in remote is to just go to code and click on branches. You can see the list. Another is to run the git branch command. Well, this is the repository that we created last time, and there are no other branches on it. The only branch here is main. But if there's multiple branches, you can see that. To switch to another branch, you can run git checkout or git switch, which are basically the same thing. Also, it's really important whenever you're making a new branch, you always pull your changes to the repository. And we'll go over all of this again when I do an example. So let's start off by making a new branch. And again, there's multiple ways to do it. To directly make a branch and switch to it, you can do git checkout -b. But for now, let's just make a branch by doing git branch and the name of the branch, which is test. Well, nothing happened, but if you run git branch now, there's 2 branches on this instead of 1, because you just created a new branch called test. To switch to that branch, we just learned 2 commands, which are git checkout and git switch. So let's check out test. As you can see, I was on main before, and now I'm on test. I can go back to main by doing git switch main or git checkout main. Pretty much the same thing. Another way to directly create a branch and switch into it is to use git checkout -b with the branch name. And now I made a new branch called test2, and I also switched into it simultaneously, which is exactly what's in the write-up. The next important thing is to merge a branch. So before we do that, let's do something else. We made these branches, right? But they're all in my machine. So if we go to the actual repository and we click on branches, there's only main here. So to actually see those, what do you think we should do to actually see those on the GitHub repository? Yep, we push. So let's git push. There's no upstream branch. Okay, so an upstream branch means a branch that is located in the remote repository. So let's do that. Exactly what it's telling you to do. This command basically means push this branch to a branch in origin called test2. So basically it's pushing and it's setting that branch to be the upstream branch or the branch in the remote repository, which is called test2. We go back there, do that, it's test2. A way to skip that is let's go back to test. We can do git push origin test, which is pretty much the same as this, except it's not directly setting it as upstream. It's pushing everything in test to a branch in the remote repository called test. So I just made 2 new branches. You can see there's no new updates on these branches. They're both updated 7 days ago, which was last week's thing, because when you make a branch, it's essentially a copy of exactly what branch you branched it off of. Okay. So now let's merge a branch into our current working branch. So to do that, let's say we want to make some changes in test, and I think we don't want this here. So I'm going to make those changes, and then I'm going to do git add dot git commit removes unnecessary lines in readme, and I'm going to do git push origin test, or I can do git push if I set upstream. So now that I've done that, what do you think will happen if I go to my code and scroll down to look at the readme? Do you think test and test2 will be there or not? Yeah, they'll still be there because the default branch that's shown is the main branch. But if I switch to my test branch and scroll down, they're no longer there because we made those changes in that specific branch. Does that make sense? Yep.
So if you like make if you're in like branch, let's say test, and then test2 doesn't exist yet, and you say like git checkout -b test2, will that branch off of main or will that branch off of test? Because you're currently
That branch will be off of test. So let's try that out right now. I'm currently on test, right? So let's check out another branch called test3. I come up with very creative names. So right now we're on test3, but if you look at readme, it doesn't have the words test and test2 in it. But if I go back to main, they'll be there. So yeah, whenever you make a branch, it's made off of your current working branch. So let's start by merging test3 back into test. So I'm currently on branch test3, which is branched off of test. So basically our current structure is we have a main, which has split off from it test and test2, and then test has split off from it another one called test3. So we don't want these many branches. Test3 is pretty much not useful to us. So let's go back to test and let's merge test3 into test. So git merge test3. Oh, well, that did nothing because we didn't do anything in test3. I didn't save it, I didn't add it, I didn't commit it. So I can add git commit -m test3 test. So that disappeared. So now let's merge test3 into test. So git merge test3. Now we got exactly what was on test3 onto test. Oh, I didn't set upstream, so I can't just do git push. But if I set upstream, that basically means the default git push pushes to the test branch on origin. But anyway, so now that I pushed that, let's go see what happened in origin. So as you can see, test3 is not here at all because we didn't push that branch to remote at all. So that branch was entirely local. But if we go to test now, it has the extra commit that we made called test3 because we merged that in there. So the basic idea of merging one branch into another is you go to the branch you want to merge the thing into, and you do git merge the name of the branch you want merged into your current branch. Any questions? Okay. And okay, another thing that happens when you're merging is what's called merge conflicts. And a merge conflict is when you're trying to merge between two branches, but both those branches have different things in them. So there's a lot of ways you can fix a merge conflict. So let's simulate one and see what that does. So in the test branch right now, we have this line called test3. So let's go to git checkout test2, which we still haven't used yet. And let's make that test4. And we do git add, git commit -m test4. And go back there, confirm that the branches still have, that the branch was updated. It was. Now let's try merging test into test2. So git merge test. Well, the merge failed because that one specific line was changed in both of these branches. So GitHub, Git by default, it doesn't know how to deal with this. It doesn't know if it should keep the change in test, keep the change in test2, or keep both changes. So in that case, you have what's called a merge conflict, which you manually have to resolve. In a text editor, they let you just directly pick accept current change, which means keep test4, accept incoming change, which means switch to test3, accept both changes, which means keep both, compare changes, so you can compare across each file, or you can start a live share session, which is work with someone else and ask them to figure it out for you. But you can also do this manually by just deleting the line. So this in reality is just text. This is VS Code being fancy and helping you figure it out. But another way to deal with the merge conflict is to just delete those lines. So I'm saying I want to keep both test4 and test3. So I'm manually dealing with this merge conflict. So I'm done with it, right? The merge conflict's fixed? Not really, because when you fix a merge conflict, it tells you have to fix your conflict and commit the result. So now I have to both modified readme, git add dot git commit -m fix merge conflict. Yep. So now if I go back to test2, it has both test4 and test3 on it. Test is still here though. You can delete a branch locally and then push it to remote, or you can also just delete a branch here, which is by doing that. I got rid of test. So right now our repository has two branches, which is test2 and test. I keep going there. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about before we talk about how to push your feature back into the main branch is linting and GitHub Actions. And these basically allow you to run a bunch of checks automatically and make sure your code is what it should be. And these include linting checks to make sure your code follows formatting guidelines, checks to make sure your code actually compiles and deploys properly. And for an example, let's look at a PR from the ACM at UCLA website. And a pull request basically means I want what I have in my branch pushed into the main branch. So as an example, let's look at this one specific PR, which wants 5 commits to be merged into main with a bunch of changes. So if we go into all of that, if we go all the way to the bottom, we can see that there are a bunch of checks completed here. And a lint check is what we talked about, which ensures that the style lint and the CSS and the JavaScript is formatted correctly. We have a build check, we have the pages change check, we have headers check, and we have what's called a deploy preview check, which basically makes a preview of the deploy. So you can check to make sure that when you push it back in, nothing, whatever is supposed to change has changed and not something that isn't supposed to change. So these are called GitHub Actions, and you can set them up to automatically run. You can also set up actions to automatically run whenever you make a commit or whenever you push something. In the case of the website, it's only made to run every time you make a pull request. Any questions? Okay. So the last thing is a pull request and a code review. which goes back there. Let's go to temp. Now, let's say I worked on test2 and I want all my changes to be pushed back into main. So I'm going to do this thing called a pull request, which is basically a request saying, push everything I have in test2 into main. And then you explain the pull request. So you say, test2 changes changes. Oh, I'm on caps lock. Changes readme text and a more detailed description. And then I create a pull request. And this pull request is going to be in pull requests. This one's open right now. For this specific repository, I have no check setup and no review setup. So I can just merge it directly. I can confirm merge. And I can delete branch. So when we go back to our code, there's no more branches left because we merged all the branches back in. You can see a new commit saying merge pull request 1 from test2. And if we scroll down, we have test4 and test3, which was what was in test2. Okay, now this entire thing, let's go over with an example. Basically, the procedure for pushing any feature or change usually involves all of these. First, you find an issue and you're assigned that issue to resolve. So let's look at something that I did yesterday. This is a closed issue, so it's already been done. I should have opened this before, but let's just never mind. Okay, I'm not great at finding this, but I have the PR open. Yeah. Okay, so maybe there was no issue for this one, but I can use the dev team page example. Okay, so let's look at this issue. This was an issue on the ACM website, which I wrote called add dev team intern to the dev team page. And then I gave an explanation of the issue, which is go to the directory and add the intern. Then I assigned it to myself. So it was my job to fix it. And then after doing that, I opened the website in VS Code and I made a branch. We can see this branch was called add dev interns, which is currently deleted because the PR has been merged in. So let's close all of those. Yeah. So the first step is I find an issue and I'm assigned that issue to resolve. And then I pulled to make sure that whenever I make a branch, I have all the most recent changes. And then on my specific branch, which was add dev intern, I made all the changes that I had to. And you can see those changes by going to files changed. And then after that, I pushed all my changes to remote, which was pushing them to the add dev interns page. And then I opened a PR to merge them into main. After that, my code ran through all the checks and it passed all of the checks, including the one to check if there's a merge conflict. If there's a merge conflict in a typical workflow, you don't fix it while merging into main because you're not allowed to merge into main because that's the branch that's deployed. So what you usually do is you go to your specific branch, you merge main into that branch, you fix the merge conflict and then re-push your changes. Once all of your checks are passed, you can request a review from someone, and I did it from Sid. And once if the person requests any changes for you to make, you make those changes. And since there were none here and it was approved, I merged it into main and I deleted the branch. And that was deployed into main. So if you go, if you check main right now, all the code that I wrote here is going to be in main. That's the typical workflow when you have an issue that you're assigned and you have to make sure it works. Any questions?
So, just so I understand it, merging a branch into main locally and then pushing main is the same as like just creating a pull request on GitHub and then.
I'm sorry, what?
So if I like, let's say I pull. So if I pull main into my local machine and merge a branch into main and then push main on upstream, does that produce the same result as just creating a pull request on a branch?
Yep.
Okay.
But in most repositories, pushing to main is not allowed directly.
Okay.
Which is to ensure that nothing messes with what's currently being deployed.
Right. Yeah.
So that's why we follow the pull request, even for the smallest changes. Any other questions? Do you have anything to add?
You select settings for branch protection rules. As you can see.
Oh, yeah, that's cool. Yeah. Okay. So where is the wait? Okay, never mind. I don't have that in here. I'll do that here. So yeah, so you can check that by basically setting branch protection rules to ensure that people can't really change any name. And you can use a regular expression, make sure people can't, push directly to that branch. So require a pull request, require status checks, require conversation resolution. The first three are all that what's there in the ACM website repository. The later ones are signed commits, linear history, etc. So you can set branch protection rules to prevent people from directly pushing to main or to any other branches that are important. Anything else?
The .github. Let's see.
Oh,
The actions.
do
Obviously, it's rules.
you want to take?
Sure.
Okay. I am handing it back to Matt.
All right. All right, let me share screen real quick. Earlier, when Advaith was talking about what you can do within a GitHub repository, there are another folder you can add called .github inside of your stuff. Like inside of .github, you can see that there are workflows. And what a workflow is that earlier when Advaith was talking about how you can run a test to make sure that when your code before you start pushing to main passes all these tests, this is an example of one of the tests that we're talking about, where you can essentially describe saying how you want to test your code and to see if it passes or fails. And inside of a repository, you can make your own tests by simply adding a .yml file. If you want to read up on how exactly you can make all these GitHub tests, you can simply just search up Github Actions, and there's a huge slew of CI/CD or continuous integration and continuous deployment that you can learn about to see. If you want to learn more, we can go into it in more detail in the future. But for now, this is just a quick intro into everything that GitHub and Git allows you to do to work on with other people. So to recap, what we've covered this quarter is a lot about how we can make static websites and how to collaborate and work on them and share our code to other people. So looks like my projector is off right now. And next week or next quarter, I mean to say, what we will discuss is how instead of simply making static websites, we can make dynamic websites that can respond to changes in user input, as well as how we can make some really powerful and interactive websites using the JavaScript framework, and a little bit more about some web development backend design as well. So far, though, we have learned everything we need to make awesome portfolio websites, and I'm excited to see what we will work on in the future. We will always meet each other next quarter as well, and I hope to see you guys then.